Hello and welcome to the third SAGIS Training video. In the previous video, we ran open and update on the Saglandia training model. The model is now ready for its first simulation. To do so, the first thing we need to do is create a scenario where we will indicate where that file needs to be created. So first, we'll move into the SIMCAT toolbox and select again General Settings. In the General Settings window, the first thing that we need to do is set up the path for the .dat file to be created. To do so, we click in the folder or browse icon, and then we will navigate to the folder in our hard drive where we want to create that file. I already have selected the path where I want to put my .dat file. The next thing will be to input the name of the .dat file in this box. I am going to call it test, and I'm going to press save. You will notice that SAGIS automatically has added the correct suffix to the file. If you add the suffix yourself, it won't add it again. It will recognize that you have already added it and just leave it at that. The next thing is to add a description. Please make sure not to call your scenarios default. So for example, we could say test for video training. And then the scenario ID, which is very important. We are going to name this scenario test as well as the .dat file. You can call it anything you want. I would recommend do not use names with spaces. If you need to separate different words, use underscores. So for example, we could call this test_1. Similarly, I would also recommend to try to keep .dat file names as well as scenario names as short as possible. And if you need to hold more information in that scenario name or that file name, use a code that you can then reference to a table that is stored independently of the information in the SAGIS model. Once we have input these 3 bits of information, we'll press create, and then the scenario test_1 will automatically become the active scenario. We'll press apply. We'll get confirmation that the test_1 scenario has been activated, and we'll press OK. Once this process has been completed, we are ready to run Create SIMCAT. To run Create SIMCAT, we'll select it from the SIMCAT toolbox, Create SIMCAT File option. The Create SIMCAT window is the most complex of all the windows in the add-in, and in fact, Create SIMCAT is by far the most complex process in the whole of SAGIS. This is due to the complexity of creating a .dat file. In this video, we're going to be explaining how to use the Create SIMCAT form. However, I will not explain every single option in the form, and that is because some of the options are too advanced and they wouldn't make sense at this point in the training series. You could, of course, simply press Run now, and the default options would be enough to create a .dat file. They are, again, just like with Open and Update, designed to fit most of the scenarios. But in case you need more fine-tuning, so inside the settings, we have some global settings that would switch on or off specific sectors. This being the point sources sector or all of the diffuse sources sectors. These ones are generally activated always by default, and you would only think of activating one of these sectors if you were, for example, running a calibration or any specific scenario where you want to see what happens to water quality when you do not consider any of the point sources, for example. It's not very common that we tweak these 2 settings. A far more common setting is apply calibration. With any SAGIS model that you've received, you will also receive calibration tables for both flow and for water quality. Like with any model, a model is only worth the data that is used to calibrate it. Models are imperfect representations of reality, and without proper calibration and validation, comparing the results against observed data in the environment that would not be fit for purpose. So with that in mind, just make sure that if you have a model that has calibration tables, you select the correct ones and also select the Apply Calibration checkboxes once you have selected your calibration tables for both flow and water quality before you press Run. On the top right, we've got a few options. Highways as loads will basically represent the highways diffuse sector instead of concentrations as a load input. It's not very common. NPT diffuse files, make sure to create non-parametric files in order to represent inputs from the diffuse sectors. This is a little bit more complicated and we'll delve into that in future videos. Sector tracking, this one is very important. This will tell SIMCAT that we want to track sources not only from the point sector, which is always enabled by default, but actually also from the diffuse sector. Override lake tables. This is useful if you're running the lakes model, so we will address this setting in particular during the lakes model video. Diffuse intermittents as loads. Again, this is very specific and we'll discuss that in a future video. Recalculate bird inputs if, for any reason, the load tables corresponding to your bird diffuse input load to different water bodies has changed. You will need to select this checkbox to make sure that those changes make it to the final DAT file. Again, this is not very common and you don't need to worry about it right now at this stage in the learning process. And run without lakes, it's again referring to functionality related to the lake model that we are not going to describe in this video. To activate said lakes model, basically you will need to check this box called lake inputs, and that prepares the model and therefore the DAT file to be run, taking into consideration that after running the DAT file, we're going to run the lakes model using the outputs from the DAT file. If we look at some of the hidden options right now, this Select on Map button lets us start the model from a different location. This is generally not important unless we're running a submodel, which again will receive its own video later in the series. We can exclude diffuse sectors, similar to the SAGIS settings that we had at the top, but more grained and oriented to specific diffuse sectors. Same thing for point sources. We could exclude specific types of features from the map and therefore from the DAT file if desired. If we are using monthly data, which is not part of this tutorial, we will need to make sure that whichever sector has been set up with monthly data is also enabled for monthly data to be applied in here. And then finally, this calibration visualization, it's not part of the Create SIMCAT form in the sense that it's not going to affect the DAT file itself. It's a setting that allows you to plot. It's like a mini plotting tool inside this form that will allow you to plot whichever calibration table has been applied as a symbology. So you can visualize the adjustment factors that the calibration table is going to apply to your DAT file in the map and decide if they are correct or just carry out an assessment on them. With this in mind, I'm not going to select calibration tables in this case, but the final DAT file would look exactly the same, except that it would tell you that it has used calibration tables. And then we will press Run. The DAT file takes a few minutes to create, depending on the number of determinants that you have got selected in your current scenario, as well as the size of your model, which in particular, as you can imagine, is very relevant. It's also a process that produces numerous messages and warnings. It is very unlikely that when the process is finished, you will see no warnings. I encourage you to take a look at the messages that the Create SIMCAT DAT file process produces at least once and question if there are any warnings, what is it that the warning is saying, and make sure that there's no action that is required on your part as part of those warnings. These warnings could be things like, for example, a table that you have indicated it's expected, like for example, diffuse loads from a particular sector, and yet the table has not been found in your model, and so on. That being said, if you received a model from the Environment Agency where the data file has already been produced, chances are that you will have no problem when rerunning this model, because it should produce the exact same outputs that have already been produced. Now Create SIMCAT has completed. We can close this window. To run the data file, again, we go to SIMCAT, run SIMCAT, and all of the data files present in the current scenario folder will appear here. We will select the one that we want to run, test.dat, run reverse SIMCAT, the catchment simulator, and press run. Automatically, this triggers SIMCAT, and SIMCAT will start running the data file. As you can see, SIMCAT will tell you what percentage of completion of the data file or the model, to be more specific, has been processed so far, and it will also show you some of the results as they are being generated. That being said, in general, this information is quite fleeting, as it just scrolls past you and you don't need to pay much attention to it unless there is an error. So you can let it run, go for a nice cup of coffee, and when you come back, hopefully we can look at those results. Now it's about to complete, 90%. You can change windows, minimize it, and by all means, if you go back to ArcGIS Pro, you can press OK and close this window whilst SIMCAT is running. That will not affect the SIMCAT run at all. Now, once SIMCAT shows that the calculations have completed, you can close this window with no fear. And then in the next video, we'll take a look at how to visualize the outputs. In the meantime, as an exercise, I suggest that you try to replicate what you've seen in this video in your own model. So create your own scenario and create that file. Try different settings, and if you have a software to compare text files, such as, for example, Notepad++, I would suggest that you compare the files between different data files that you have created with different settings and try to understand how they're different and how the changes in the settings that you have selected reflect in those different data files that you have generated. And of course, try to run the data files and make sure that they run to completion. And that's everything for this video. I hope you found it interesting and useful. Thanks for watching, and happy modeling. See you in the next one.